This is a lecture from OpenTuition.
Welcome to this series of lectures on the Strategic Business Leader March 2020 exam. I'm not going to develop a model answer. There's an adequate model answer which is published by ACCA. I'm going to concentrate rather more on perhaps the approach to each of the questions and perhaps how we can use models to help us to develop some ideas. The model answer is interesting because it appeals to, I think, no models whatsoever. And it makes one think, why have these been included in the syllabus? Why have you spent time learning them? And I think maybe the point is that the examiner wants to emphasize that the answer is not a description of the models. The answer is very much solving the problem of the company, which is featured in the examination paper. My approach will be rather more to say, is there any sort of model that might give me some sort of a start, maybe a few hints about how I could structure the answer, maybe to spark off some ideas, not necessarily then to follow the model slavishly, but to use it where I think it is useful, almost to leave out parts of it where I think it's going to contribute nothing whatsoever. And in the last resort, if you can't think of a model, then go at it on a common sense basis. But exam is not an exam in common sense. There is a very substantial syllabus and body of knowledge which you are expected to know about. Before you start any of these questions, you really need to download the question paper and then to look at the requirements and the exhibits. And the lecture is divided into basically three parts, one for each of the requirements, although the requirements very often have A, B or ABC parts within them. And we'll deal with kind of one set of requirements at a time. So to get started, please download the 2020 exam. If you don't download it and become familiar with the exhibits and the requirements and everything which is written there, if you don't give some thought, requirement by requirement, as to how you might have approached it, what you might have thought about saying, then when we give the presentation, it's rather kind of wasted on you. It's rather like no thought from you, just reading a kind of proposed approach to the answer from me. And you certainly don't get as much as you could from the presentations. So if you haven't downloaded that information, the exam paper, carefully read through that and the exhibits, you know or should know by now that the bulk of the information is in the 5, 6, 7 exhibits, which whatever is there, become familiar with those, then please do that now before progressing to the next slide. You can pause the recording to give yourself time for that. So the first requirements which we have here, 1A, is to prepare briefing notes for the board which analyse the main risks which threaten TT for you, being awarded new contracts and retaining current contracts. Now, the sorts of things that we need to, I think, carefully think about in here, let me just get my pen working, is you have to think about the format, and it could be briefing notes as here, part of a report, it could be a letter, it could be kind of 4 slides for presentation to the board or a client meeting there. The verb part really is analyse. And analyse is very much more than list. Analyse is to kind of examine, to take apart, to explain why this risk is there and why it is important to TT4U. And also we have to think it's a problem about awarded new contracts and retaining current contracts. So if you don't answer in the right format, if you don't analyze, if you fall short of that and merely list without any emphasis, if you like, on what the really important things are, why they're important, if you make them up and don't scour, if you don't really search through the information carefully to try to identify the risks, if you don't look at it for risks for being awarded new contracts and retaining current contracts, you can't possibly get even the majority of the marks on this. The examiner is very keen to emphasize that the content of the case study, particularly the exhibits, contains in a way all you need to know in terms of that particular scenario. In other words, the risks which you talk about should be certainly predominantly, almost exclusively, risks which are flagged up from within the scenario. So at the time I'm doing this, we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's obviously nothing in the case study about that. The case studies are written about a year in advance, so it was written in rather happier times. And if you say, one of the risks about getting new contracts is that the COVID-19 pandemic may stop anyone awarding new contracts, that is irrelevant to the scenario and the information you're given there. Note the professional marks, which is going to be awarded. There's 2 marks available in this question for analysis skills. And the examiner does give a kind of guidance as to what gets hardly any professional marks up to, what will get the maximum professional marks. And here I've just put the 2 extremes of this in here. First of all, if you haven't addressed analysis skills at all, then you've provided a generic list of risks which are not linked to the information in the exhibits. So in other words, it's just book learning. It's no application involved, no understanding of the scenario involved at all. Up at the other extreme, where analysis skills have been displayed to a very great extent, you've done very well in these, the answer is constructed around the risks which are important for TT4U, winning and retaining contracts. The significance of these risks is clearly explained because not all risks are the same. It may require some explanation on your behalf to say why you think something is a risk, because maybe the examiner hasn't thought about it. And when you read model answers, do bear in mind that the examiners are very flexible if you were to say and justify something which they hadn't thought about in the original marking scheme. So don't be frightened about saying something provided you can justify it. So the risk is clearly explained and supported by data taken from the exhibits. And the answer is to be in the correct format here. Briefing notes, very simple kind of format. It's very like a memorandum really, to, from, about, date. But instead of saying memorandum at the top, it'll say briefing notes at the top. And then normally you'd have some maybe numbered paragraphs to give it a bit of structure. So here we are dealing with risks. And can we get any help at all from any kind of academic studies that you might have done, say using our notes, our lectures, or other publishers' notes and so on there? Can you remember anything whatsoever that enabled us to perhaps identify risks, categorize risks, rank risks, anything of that sort? And maybe with a bit of luck, it's certainly covered in our notes, you will come across the following kind of categorization of risks. This is very common. The risks can be classified as strategic, operational, compliance, and reporting. Now, to some extent, it doesn't much matter whether you do actually categorize something as a strategic risk or as an operational risk. It's better if you get the obvious ones right. So a strategic risk is kind of taking a wrong turning, sticking with old technology when, 3 years ago you should have moved to new technology. Maybe sticking with, conventional supermarkets when really people are wanting much more to have shopping on the internet and so on. That kind of top-level decision is a strategic risk. Operational ones are more day-to-day things which go wrong, probably more the province of managers not being that good, maybe. Compliance risks, breaking rules, breaking laws, breaking regulations. And there can also be reporting risks, where maybe you report the wrong information, and because people rely on that, then obviously you're exposed to some risk. Now, I don't think there's anything here on reporting risk. That's my opinion. So just left that one off. But I have used a kind of format of the strategic risks, the operational risks, and the compliant risks, just to maybe help me structure the answer a little bit, to spark off some ideas which we might be worth kind of investigating. Now, really all I'm going to do is to list some of the ideas. I'm not going to, do a full answer where I say this is really important risk, this is not so important, and so on. You'll see that in the model answer. We're much more at the planning and approach stage rather than progressing through to a nicely written answer. So you're reading all this documentation here that comes, and we look at risks. There's risks to do, remember, with winning and retaining contracts. We've taken note, I hope, that they are in a high-tech business information technology consultants. And the sort of risks that I came out at maybe, or arguably on the strategic level, were as follows. First of all, we have here the original founders. 4 of the original founders are still in key roles on the board. Now, there might be very worthy people. They're obviously have got some business acumen, otherwise it wouldn't have lasted for 20 years. The business is obviously reasonably successful. But I do begin to wonder if 20 years they've not got a bit old. And now by that, I'm not trying to be discriminatory against them as such, but we're in a high-tech business, and quite often it's the young people coming out of college or with a couple of years' experience who are buying up to date on the new technology and what people want, who are buying up to date, for example, on the use of Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and so on. Whereas it could be the older directors here, although intellectually they know about these technologies, are not that turned on by them. The other thing I could maybe bring into this business of them being there for 20 years, apart from maybe getting a little bit bored and complacent, is really, has there been enough input at board level to new ideas, or are these people rather kind of insular, inward-looking? We've survived 20 years on this. I see no reason to change. But it's something we could certainly float and put up an argument for. And I think one of them said that they had been ill. And okay, they might not be much more than, 45, 50 years old. But at some point, illness may take a toll on these people. And have they, got any succession which has been thought about? And succession can be important in giving clients confidence. And new ideas can be important in winning new work. So are they aware of the latest applications? It says they've done, in here you should come across it in the exhibits, they've done a client survey, and the client survey is actually quite good, maybe at identifying some things which you could describe as risks here. Clients say that old basic services are provided, and it's not necessarily what clients want. Almost getting back to my idea that the directors might be a little complacent, a little bit nearly past it. You require strong client and sector knowledge, and it's not absolutely clear that we have that. That, I think, came out of one of the articles that was around there. There seems to be, when you get into it, maybe a little bit of misreading of government. They maybe arguably think that government's an easy touch, whereas one of the exhibits say that government is becoming more and more demanding. Government is getting its act together rather more in IT. There's a criticism that they are reactive, not proactive. Again, a feeling of kind of resting on your laurels, of not being keen and not staying up to date and not embracing the new, being self-satisfied. And this kind of comes across fairly obviously to clients in certainly that survey. The operational risks are again fairly plain when you begin to think about them. What are they maybe doing wrong on a day-to-day basis? And again, in the survey that they've done for clients' opinions, it said they have an old-fashioned website, which is not going to be any good at finding new businesses. They seem to have a very poor use of social media, tend to discount it or ignore it. There seems to be an inconsistency in maybe how they when you ring up, I think this was to do. One of the clients said, when you ring up, sometimes you talk to someone who knows what they're talking about, really does something useful for you, whereas some other times you get someone who's not that interested or not that good, and so on and there. So you never know quite what you're going to get. There seems to be a lack of knowledge about your own services. So again, clients will notice this when they ring up and you ask, can you do cloud-based services? And they say, yes, we can. And you say, how much does it cost? And you say, I have no idea. There's a complaint about very slow email responses. And there may be just a hint that we don't know yet, but I think we can probably put it in. But there's a hint that some data hacking is going on. The client, or TT4U, is confident that I think Rex has not suffered, that there's a potential blackmailer somewhere who hasn't really managed to hack in at all. But obviously there is a potential operational risk there, that our security and confidentiality of client data is not great. And then compliance risks, and we think of anything there. And it could be compliance with data protection. Getting back to the alleged incident of Rex, if it did emerge that there had been an incident where confidential information was lost, then not only could there be legal penalties, but there will be publicity and there will be potential reputational damage. And given that TT4U is in the business of IT, the reputational damage could be particularly embarrassing for them. As I said, I couldn't particularly think of very much on reporting risk, but I think how many marks report? I think it was 10 marks for. I think it was 8 marks. I think there for the risks, 2 marks for professional. Briefing notes. I think, we've got more than enough there. Let's say I like to work on a kind of budget, if you like, of 1.5 marks per point. Half a mark for, maybe saying the key staff are a bit old, and then 1 mark for explaining why this could have adverse consequences on retaining clients and winning new data, because they're not keen enough, they're not up to date, and so on. So even at 1.5 marks there, we only need about 6 points to get us up to 8 marks. I'm sure we have enough to get a very comfortable pass with what we've kind of said there, provided we, answer the question, that we carefully explain the risks, why they might arise, make sure they're coming from the data which is in the question, put it in the right format. We will certainly be getting, 1 to 1.5 at least out of the professional skills. Question 1b. When you read the question, you'll see that in the board meeting there are 2 kind of proposals put forward for how the business should develop in the future. And one of them put forward here by the IT director, he or she is very keen on pursuing what's known as the Internet of Things. And then the services director is very keen on winning more government sector work. So those are the 2 strategic options, and we have to evaluate those, appraise the 2 options. What's meant by evaluate? Generally speaking, when you're looking at evaluate, you want pluses and minuses. Pros and cons. Good things about this, bad things about that. You may be asked to come to a conclusion on it. Does a model answer actually come to a conclusion on it? It may be the sort of thing that we can't sensibly get to a conclusion. Maybe we're not even asked for a conclusion. Yeah, the conclusion they've got here is the proposals are not mutually exclusive. They could invest in both of these here. Got different risk and return profiles. I think we could probably get away without a conclusion, provided in our evaluations for both of the options we go to the pluses and minuses successfully. Again, just looking at the range of marks you might get in the evaluation skills here. No marks at all. Look at only one option. You don't look at the pros and cons. You just kind of explain it or something. Not particularly related to TT for you. You go herring off and say, in general, the generic strategic options are cost leadership or differentiation. 0 marks for saying that. Not really relevant, particularly to what they're asking here at all. So just be aware when you don't kind of bite your C strategic option, you go, generic options. Nothing to do with it. It's this company and what options does it have. Then very well, for very high full professional marks on evaluation skills, the candidate has provided a well-balanced discussion of both options, shows both options clearly in a wider organizational and competitive context. The answer is in the correct format, which is just a section of a report. I would probably divide it into 2. One for Internet, for all, or whatever they call it, the Internet of Things, plus and minus, and then the government work, plus and minus. So that I'm very plain in evaluating, and it's very, very much linked to the data which is there. The sort of answers that would come up, again, the model answer didn't use any sort of model. And by far the commonest model to be used when you're asked to evaluate 2 strategies is the suitability, feasibility, acceptability model of very well known, very well embedded in kind of strategic work. And again, it gives you just a little bit of a leg up, a little bit of a list, Think about the Internet of things. Is it suitable? What's meant by suitable? Well, the sort of things that's meant by suitable is it catching on? Is it going to be a growth model, a growth industry that is suitable? Feasible, very often surrounding resources. Do we have the resources to deliver that sort of strategy? Do we have the right technical staff? Maybe. Do we have the right reputation to go to our clients and suddenly say, we're going to embrace this glittering new development internet for things? And then acceptability. Is it acceptable to our shareholders, for example? Is it acceptable to our clients? And we're told, I think, right at the beginning of the case study, that in the overview, I think it is here, somewhere in here. Yes, 2 years ago, the company achieved a listing on the National Stock Exchange for smaller companies. Some of the external shareholders who indicated they would like to see the company progress towards a full listing. So obviously they're very keen on expansion. They may, of course, be asked to put more money in. They'll have to also bear in mind the risk which either their current investment or future investment is coming to. And risk will be important in appraising these two investments at all. If the company is going into the Internet of Things and there's no experience there at all, then there might be high risk, but it might be the future. If it's going into government, then it has got dealings with government at the moment. It knows something about that market. But of course, I think it does say in the scenario that the profit margins in government are a little lower. So we have the old kind of problem, really. Do we want to go for high risk, high return, or rather do the shareholders want to go for high risk, high return, or would they rather go for low risk, low return? Of course, we can't answer that here because we don't quite have the information for it. Anyway, on the suitability, I came up with the many sectors opening up in this. Medicine, for example, where you can monitor people, remotely monitor their blood pressure, heart rate, and so on there. You can make intelligent buildings that look at access control, put on the lighting, put on off the heating, and so on. There is a danger this might be a kind of fad. The people say, oh, it's quite interesting having my fridge connected to the internet, and you use it for a month, and then after that you go to your fridge and actually write a list there. That's a risk. There can be security problems with this if people's information is being held remotely now by some cloud server who begins to know about your health, for example. There are technology concerns, not only about the hardware and the software, but also about, as I was saying, the personnel kind of involved. Government, there's lots of work, but lower profit margins, and they seem to be getting stricter in terms of the level of service which they require. Feasibility, as I said, do we have the expertise? Do we have the staff? Is our reputation creditable? Will our clients come to us for Internet on Things? Do we have any presence? And if we don't, we'll have to create a presence that convinces people we can do it. The government, is it feasible? Yes, we could build on current relationships. There's less upfront money involved, less technically demanding. So feasibility may be an easier thing to achieve with government, although not as profitable. And finally, acceptability. Will clients, they may be doubling up on some points here, but as long as we've identified them, we will only mention them once in our answer. But again, is it acceptable to potential clients? Will they believe that we're up to the job? It gets us into a new sector. There could be greater fast growth potential as demanded by shareholders, but of course greater risk. The government, can we comply with the increasingly strict service requirements? Will government find our levels of ability and service levels acceptable there? And is it acceptable to our wider shareholders? A longer, slower, safer growth, or a shorter, faster, but higher risk growth? Seems to be quite a bit to do with the heart of this. We could try and do both, of course. But we have got quite a bit of here, pros and cons, if you like, here, to again get us, I think, quite a few marks in there. It's 12 marks for the pros and cons in both of these. So that's going to be roughly 3 for the Internet of Things pros, 3 for the cons, 3 for the government advantages, 3 for the government disadvantages, and then in this one, 4 professional marks available for analysis, and that's really quite high. And again, I think using this little model, not even saying I'm going to analyze this using the model, framework, suitability, feasibility, acceptability. Just do it. It's not something which requires any kind of explanation. The examiner will know exactly what you're talking about. It's a ready-made, neat, good format. 1C of the question asks us to prepare an email, which is really in 2 parts. First of all, advising on the actions we can take to ensure the controls on the confidentiality of data operate effectively, and then discusses the risks and ethical issues relating to communicating the threat to the client risk investments. That threat is discussed in Exhibit 5. And the skepticism skills that we're supposed to be looking at here in the requirement, full requirement says it is skepticism skills in relation to the views of the marketing director. And in Exhibit 5, the marketing director is saying we don't need to pursue this threat anymore. We don't need to tell Rex Investments about it. Because they're a prickly client, we may lose them. So the things we have to look at within this, I think, first of all, if we have not at all a type of professional skepticism skills, it's very general. It could just talk about, typical controls in a computer system. It could just go down ethical principles without being tailoring to this particular situation. Do very well. It discusses the risks of disclosure, non-disclosure of ethics, and I should also, of course, talk about the controls and confidentiality of data there. Using general ethical principles as appropriate to support the analysis in the correct format. So what we're looking at here, it has to be email. It's not asking us about the controls and the confidentiality of information. It's that they operate effectively, which is a different thing. And then discusses the risks and ethical issues relating to communicating the threat to the client Rex Investments. When you look at skepticism, there's an element of saying, okay, what you say might be true. You're saying to the marketing director, maybe we shouldn't tell Rex Investments about this threat. But really, I'm not going to just accept that. I'm going to put some counter arguments to that, and perhaps really get you to argue why your view that we should stay quiet is the best one. So in skepticism, professional skepticism, you're not saying someone is lying, but you're saying for every assertion made, I want some kind of additional proof. I've got certain questions before I just accept that. So looking at this here, there's the operation of controls. So how can we ensure that the operation of controls is taking place effectively? And it could be by ensuring that our people are trained so they know what the operational controls are. It could be observing them. So we could observe people's workstations, make sure they don't have their passwords on a post-it note, on their video monitors and so on. It could be observing the doors are kept locked. It could be observing backup logs and the like. It could be ensuring that passwords are changed regularly. We could be looking at processing logs. We could be looking at logs to do with the firewall, which would be reporting on hacking, and which would report should report if there had been any successful breach of our firewall, so that people could actually get in to our system and so on. There's the use of mobile devices. Are people allowed to take company laptops home? Where obviously they're out of our sight and control. It could be left in the backseat of a car and subject to theft. Can you plug a USB stick into the computer and maybe take confidential documents, information like that? So it is looking at the effectiveness of controls. Maybe there is some sort of a almost accident book, a kind of book where breaches of security, problems of security are noted. Maybe we've had previous complaints from clients that they feel that data has gone missing or been compromised in some way. And then there's the disclosure of the blackmail attempt. Remember, it is the risks and ethical issues. Two things to be looking at here. Sometimes an ethical issue might be so slight that the risk is insubstantial, and we actually prefer to live with that. So the ethical issues, a framework would be quite nice, and we could use the ACCA one. We could talk about some of these, maybe integrity, objectivity, professional competence and due care, confidentiality, professional behaviour. Or maybe what we might want to make use of is something like the Tucker's framework, where we ask questions like, is it profitable? Is it legal? Is it fair? Is it right? Is it sustainable or environmentally sound? I don't think we need necessarily to go through either of these, covering all the ethical principles, if you like, which any of them arise. But again, it's going to spark off maybe some kind of buzzwords here. So we could say, that the ACCA has an ethical principle of integrity. And integrity means being honest. And to what extent are we being honest with our client if we keep this threat secret? Because, of course, despite what the marketing director says, we have no guarantee that data has not gone missing. And the risk, of course, is that we keep it secret, and then, some great scandal explodes because it's been discovered that confidential data has escaped. And, of course, we're in much more trouble because we didn't forewarn anyone at all. There is professional competence and due care. It might be showing professional competence in due care, it might be showing professional behaviour. If we went to our client and said, we're being open with you, our professional behaviour, duty, if you like, ethical duty says we have the client, we have the information about the blackmail attempt, and we ought to make you aware of it. We don't think there's anything in it, and so on, because our professional competence and due care, and we are, after all, IT consultants, but we are confident that no data breach has been made, but we want to be upfront with you. And that could be tied into Tucker here. Is it fair? Is it fair that you don't tell a major client that this threat has been received? Maybe they need to protect themselves. Maybe they need to investigate it. And it would be unfair to keep it secret. And almost certainly it's not going to be right. How would you feel if your let's say doctor had this blackmail attempt and there was a risk that your medical records are gone astray or your Amazon purchase records are gone astray and so on? It's usually much less hurtful, much less risky if you're upfront with people, tell them everything you know, rather than hoping for the best. Because if things go wrong then, you're going to be in big trouble.